The complete story of Gideon, a mighty warrior in God's plan. The story of Gideon is found in the book of Judges, chapters 6-8. Gideon, also called Jerubbaal, was an unlikely hero chosen by God to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Midianites. His journey from fear to faith demonstrates God's power to use ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. Judges 6:10. The Israelites once again turned away from God and began worshiping other gods. As a result, God allowed the Midianites to oppress them for 7 years. The Midianites, along with their allies, the Amalekites and other eastern peoples, would invade Israel every year during the harvest season. They came like a swarm of locusts, bringing their tents, camels, and livestock. They would camp on the land and destroy the crops, leaving nothing for the Israelites to eat. They also took their sheep, cattle, and donkeys, leaving the people with nothing to survive on. The Israelites were so terrified that they hid in caves, mountain strongholds, and other secret places. They were completely overpowered and left in great poverty. This desperate situation caused the Israelites to cry out to the Lord for help. God, in His mercy, sent a prophet to speak to the people. The prophet reminded them of all that God had done for them in the past, delivering them from slavery in Egypt, rescuing them from their enemies, and giving them the land of Canaan. However, the prophet also rebuked them for their disobedience, saying, "You have not obeyed me." Despite their unfaithfulness, God did not abandon His people. He heard their cries and planned to deliver them from their oppressors, showing His faithfulness and mercy even when they had turned away from Him. Judges 6:11-24. Gideon was hiding from the Midianites when God chose him for an extraordinary mission. He was threshing wheat in a winepress, a place not meant for threshing, to keep the grain hidden from the enemy. Suddenly, the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon was startled. He couldn't understand how God could be with Israel when they were suffering so much. He asked, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened? Where are all His wonders that our ancestors told us about? Now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The angel turned to Gideon and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand." "Am I not sending you?" Gideon doubted himself. He replied, "How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Gideon felt unqualified and small, but the angel reassured him, saying, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Still uncertain, Gideon asked for a sign to prove that the message truly came from God. He went to prepare an offering for the angel. Gideon brought out meat, bread, and broth, and placed them on a rock as instructed. The angel of the Lord touched the offering with the tip of his staff, and fire consumed it. Then the angel disappeared. Overwhelmed and afraid, Gideon realized he had been in the presence of the angel of the Lord. He exclaimed, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But God comforted him, saying, "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." Filled with awe and gratitude, Gideon built an altar to the Lord on that very spot. He named it Yahweh Shalom, meaning, "The Lord is peace." This marked the beginning of Gideon's journey as God's chosen deliverer for Israel. Judges 6:25-32. That night, God gave Gideon a bold and challenging command. He told him to destroy the altar of Baal that belonged to his father and to cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. Then God instructed Gideon to build a proper altar to the Lord on the same high ground, using the wood from the Asherah pole to offer a burnt sacrifice. Though Gideon wanted to obey, he was afraid of how his family and the townspeople would react. To avoid confrontation, he took 10 of his servants and carried out God's command under the cover of darkness. Together, they tore down the altar to Baal, chopped down the Asherah pole, and built a new altar to the Lord. There they sacrificed a bull, just as God had instructed. The next morning, the townspeople discovered what had happened. Outraged, they demanded to know who had done such a thing. After investigating, they found out it was Gideon. Furious, they went to Joash, Gideon's father, and demanded, "Bring out your son. He must die because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it." But Joash defended his son with wisdom and courage. He said to the angry crowd, "Are you going to plead Baal's case? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." The people were silenced by Joash's response. From that day on, Gideon was given the name Jerubbaal, which means, "Let Baal contend with him," as a reminder that Baal had done nothing to punish Gideon for destroying his altar. This act of courage marked a turning point for Gideon. He not only obeyed God's command, but also showed the people that the false gods they worshipped had no power. It was the first step in leading Israel back to the worship of the one true God. Judges 6:36-40. Even after God called Gideon and assured him of victory over the Midianites, Gideon still struggled with doubt. He wanted to be absolutely certain that God would save Israel through him, as promised. Gideon decided to ask for a sign from God. He said, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." That night, Gideon laid out the fleece and went to sleep. The next morning he found exactly what he had asked for. The fleece was soaking wet, but the ground around it was completely dry. When he wrung out the fleece, a whole bowl full of water came out. Even with this sign, Gideon still felt unsure. He hesitated but decided to ask God for one more confirmation. He said, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time, make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." God was patient with Gideon and granted his request. The next morning, Gideon found the fleece completely dry, while the ground around it was soaked with dew. These signs reassured Gideon that God's promise was true and that he would be with him in the mission to save Israel. Strengthened by this confirmation, Gideon was finally ready to step forward in faith and lead his people to victory over their oppressors. Judges 7 verse 1-8. Gideon, now confident in God's call, gathered a large army of 32,000 men to face the Midianites. However, God told Gideon that the army was too large. "You have too many men," God said. "I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me, saying, 'My own strength has saved me.'" To ensure the Israelites understood that their victory would come from him alone, God instructed Gideon to reduce the army. He told Gideon, "Announce to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." When Gideon gave this option, 22,000 men chose to leave, leaving only 10,000 soldiers willing to fight. But God said, "There are still too many men." He instructed Gideon to take the remaining men down to the water for a test. "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink." When the men drank, only 300 of them lapped the water with their hands to their mouths. The rest knelt down to drink directly from the stream. God told Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." Gideon obeyed. He kept the 300 men and sent the rest of the troops away, taking only their provisions and trumpets. Now with this small and unlikely force, Gideon prepared to face the massive Midianite army. God had reduced the army to make it clear that the victory would not come from human strength or numbers, but through his power. The 300 men were a testament to God's ability to use even the smallest and weakest to accomplish great things for his glory. Judges 7:9-15. That night, as Gideon and his small army of 300 men camped near the Midianites, God spoke to him. "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands," God said. But knowing Gideon might still be afraid, God added, "If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah. Listen to what they are saying, and afterward you will be encouraged to attack." Gideon, still hesitant, took his servant Purah and quietly made his way down to the edge of the enemy camp. The Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples were camped in the valley, as numerous as locusts. Their camels were countless, like grains of sand on the seashore. As Gideon approached, he overheard 2 Midianite soldiers talking. One of them was describing a dream he had. "I had a dream," the soldier said. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." The other soldier responded, This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. Hearing this, Gideon was filled with faith and courage. He immediately bowed down and worshipped God, praising him for the assurance of victory. Strengthened by this confirmation, Gideon returned to the Israelite camp and called his men together. "Get up," he said. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." This moment showed Gideon that God was in complete control, turning even the enemy's dreams into signs of encouragement for his chosen leader. With renewed confidence, Gideon prepared his small army for the battle ahead, trusting fully in God's promise of victory. Judges 7:16-25. With only 300 men, Gideon prepared for a battle unlike any other. Instead of traditional weapons, he armed each man with a trumpet, an empty jar, and a torch hidden inside the jar. These strange tools would play a key role in God's plan to defeat the massive Midianite army. Gideon divided his small force into 3 groups and positioned them around the Midianite camp. Under the cover of night, the men took their places, quietly waiting for Gideon's signal. The enemy camp below was vast and full of soldiers, unaware of the surprise that was about to unfold. At the right moment, Gideon gave the signal. The men blew their trumpets loudly, smashed their jars to reveal the torches, and shouted at the top of their voices, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The sudden noise and lights in the darkness terrified the Midianites. Thinking they were under attack by a massive army, they panicked. In the confusion, the Midianite soldiers turned their swords on one another, attacking their own comrades in the chaos. Those who survived the initial confusion fled into the night. Gideon and his men pursued the fleeing Midianites. Israelite reinforcements from the tribes of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh joined the chase. They captured key points along the Jordan River to cut off the enemy's escape. 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb, were caught and killed. Oreb was slain at a rock that would later be named after him, and Zeb was killed at a winepress that bore his name. Their heads were brought to Gideon as a sign of victory. This unconventional battle demonstrated God's power and his ability to deliver his people using unlikely means. The 300 men had no swords or spears, yet they triumphed over an army as numerous as locusts. The victory made it clear to all of Israel that the glory belonged to God alone. Gideon's obedience and faith in God's plan led to a miraculous deliverance, freeing Israel from Midianite oppression and proving that nothing is impossible with God. Judges 8, verse 1-21. After the miraculous victory over the Midianites, Gideon faced a new challenge, not from the enemy, but from his own people. The Ephraimites, one of the tribes of Israel, were upset because they had not been called to join the initial battle. They confronted Gideon angrily, saying, "Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" Instead of arguing, Gideon responded with wisdom and humility. He praised their contribution, pointing out that they had captured Oreb and Zeb, 2 Midianite leaders, and reminding them that their victory was greater than what his small force of 300 men had achieved. "What have I accomplished compared to you?" he said. His gentle answer calmed their anger, and peace was restored. Pursuing the Midianite kings. Although the Midianites had been defeated, their kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, had escaped with a remnant of their army. Gideon was determined to finish the mission and pursued them with his 300 men. As they chased the fleeing enemy, they passed through the towns of Succoth and Penuel, asking for food to sustain their weary soldiers. But the leaders of these towns refused to help. They doubted Gideon's ability to capture the Midianite kings and mocked him. "Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession?" they sneered. "Why should we give bread to your troops?" Gideon warned them of the consequences of their refusal. To the leaders of Succoth he said, "When the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hands, I will tear your flesh with thorns and briars." To the people of Penuel he vowed, "When I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower." The final confrontation. Gideon and his men continued their pursuit, crossing the Jordan River and attacking the remaining Midianite army by surprise. The enemy, caught off guard, was completely defeated, and Gideon captured Zebah and Zalmunna. On his return, Gideon kept his word. He punished the leaders of Succoth by flogging them with thorns and briars. In Penuel, he tore down the tower and punished the men of the town for their refusal to help. Finally, Gideon confronted Zebah and Zalmunna. He reminded them of a personal offense. They had killed his brothers in an earlier raid. "What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?" he asked. They replied, "Men like you, each one with the bearing of a prince." Gideon declared, "Those were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you." Gideon then called his eldest son, Jether, to execute the kings, but Jether hesitated, being only a boy and afraid to act. Zebah and Zalmunna mocked Gideon, saying, "Come, do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength." Taking their challenge, Gideon executed the kings himself, bringing justice for his family and fulfilling God's deliverance for Israel. A complete victory. Gideon's campaign ended with the complete defeat of the Midianites and their leaders. Through diplomacy, courage, and faith in God, Gideon not only secured Israel's freedom but also maintained unity among the tribes. This victory showed that God's chosen leader could overcome not just external enemies but also internal conflicts, ensuring peace and justice for the people of Israel. Judges 8:22-35. After Gideon's great victory over the Midianites, the Israelites wanted to honor him in a special way. They approached him and said, "Rule over us, you and your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." They wanted to make Gideon their king, seeing him as the one who had delivered them from their enemies. However, Gideon refused their offer. He understood that Israel's true king was God. He replied, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Gideon's humility was evident in his words. He made it clear that the glory belonged to God alone, not to him or his family. But Gideon's actions would later reveal a weakness. He asked the Israelites for the gold they had taken from the defeated Midianites, gold earrings, chains, and other precious items. The people gladly gave it to him, and Gideon used this gold to create an ephod, a sacred garment worn by priests. Unfortunately, instead of keeping the ephod as a symbol of worship to God, the Israelites began to worship it. The ephod became a snare to Israel, leading them back into idolatry. This was a tragic turn, as the people who had been freed from the oppression of the Midianites now fell into the same patterns of sin they had once experienced. Despite this, Gideon continued his leadership. He had many sons, 70 in total, with several wives and a concubine. His family grew, and Gideon lived to an old age, enjoying the peace that had come from his victories. However, after his death, Israel's commitment to God quickly faded. The people forgot both God's faithfulness and Gideon's role in their deliverance. They returned to worshiping idols, particularly the very ephod that had caused them to stumble. They soon forgot the lessons learned during their time of oppression and deliverance. Gideon's story is one of both triumph and tragedy. While he led Israel to victory and brought peace to the land, his failure to fully keep Israel focused on God's rule allowed idolatry to creep back in. His legacy was mixed, a great leader who trusted in God but whose later actions led to a downfall in Israel's faithfulness. After Gideon's death, the nation returned to the cycle of sin and repentance, showing how fragile Israel's commitment to God truly was. Lessons from Gideon's story. God uses the weak to accomplish his purposes. Gideon's humble beginnings remind us that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. Faith grows through obedience. Gideon's journey from fear to faith shows that trust in God deepens with each step of obedience. Victory belongs to the Lord. The reduction of Gideon's army illustrates that success comes from God, not human effort. Beware of idolatry. Despite his faithfulness, Gideon's ephod became a stumbling block, showing the danger of misplaced devotion.